This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Jason Rosario Braganza, welcome back to Human Coined.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you so much. Really nice to be here.
Amazing to have you back. And I understand are you in New York right now or Washington?
So I'm in New York. We've just come up from Washington after a sort of lackluster but exciting week nonetheless in DC. But yeah, we're in New York just talking about the financing for development process that's kicked off, which is part of the conversation that's helping to find where we can get all manner of finance towards the SDG Agenda 2030.
That's wonderful. But the word lackluster is I think, unfortunately sounds like a fairly telling beginning to your experience there. Why don't you tell us a bit about what was lackluster at the IMF and World Bank meetings, and maybe just talk about what they are for those who don't have the background.
Sure. So the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, usually have two meetings a year. We have them in the spring, which is during sort of March, April, and which talks about sort of the policy agenda for the rest of the year. And then there's an annual meeting, which usually takes place in the fall, which, again, it's about policy agenda setting. It's really about, trying to see where different types of commitments on reforming the architecture, macroeconomic stability, development finance discussions and negotiations take place. It's also a place where, a lot of advocacy and canvassing goes on in terms of member states trying to get, good deals from both the IMF and the World Bank for their development projects. This particular year has been dominated, of course, by a very severe and deep debt crisis affecting many countries in Africa. Close to more than half of the African countries are either in debt distress or a high risk of debt distress. In fact, 4 African countries have defaulted on their debts. This is Chad, Ethiopia, Ghana, Zambia. And so part of the meetings this past week was dominated by, what are the kind of debt restructuring processes that these countries can access that does not put further pressure on their fiscal space and further reduce their ability to provide both public services as well as a development agenda. So that's what we usually do, hanging out in DC. But it is always nice to go to DC, whether it's in the spring or in the fall. The weather was really good, but you could tell this particular time, there was a bit of a lackluster feel because of the impending elections here in the US. And so a lot of people are looking at that as a compass point in terms of their policy discussions and negotiations and so on.
And looking at your AFRODAD's understandable concerns about the international order to begin with, it's disheartening to hear that despite your limited expectations in general, you found it to be even more lackluster than usual. What would you have liked to have seen? What would you like to have realistically seen come out of this, the IMF Washington or World Bank meeting?
So I think on the IMF side, the IMF MD Kristalina Georgieva, talked about low growth, high debt. That was the theme of the entire week. But it's a bit of a paradox, expecting countries to grow themselves out of the debt situation that they're facing when, all the policy advice is geared towards making sure that creditors are serviced and particularly commercial creditors. And so, we'd have liked a lot more stronger language that appreciates this reality, that you cannot expect countries to grow out of their debt when over 50 to 60% of their tax revenue, not of their budgets, but of their tax revenue, is being allocated to servicing debt. I think the second thing is, the proposals for solutions to deal with debt restructuring in all its forms, right? Whether it's a debt service suspension initiative, whether it's a debt relief program, a reprofiling or rescheduling, or even cancellation at some point. none of these were options that were being discussed. I think the disappointing thing about it was the fund was very happy to say that they have this G20 common framework on the treatment of debt that seems to be working. And, you've got a country like Zambia that's 3 years in negotiating its restructuring of its debt under this common framework and still hasn't finalized its deal in totality. It is reaching piecemeal arrangements with particular creditors, but not in its entirety. And for them to sort of, chest thump and say, well, it's taken 3 years with Zambia, but with Ghana, it's taken, less than a year. I think it's a little bit contemptuous of what impact these delays, this lack of inclusion tends to have on the real lives of people. So we'd have liked a bit more acknowledgement of that. A slight glimmer, maybe if you like, a slither of hope that was coming out from the rhetoric, from the fund in particular, is that there is now a general acknowledgement that this is more than just a cash crunch for debtor countries. This is something that dominated their rhetoric in the last 2 years. But I think the fact that they're now realizing that in some cases there are some real solvency issues, hopefully that will be the sort of injection we needed in moving to a more progressive set of conversations and recommendations around restructuring. On the World Bank side, the big thing is the replenishment of the International Development Association. So this is sort of the concessional lending part of the World Bank group. And every so often there's a replenishment of this fund. And so there was a lot of running around trying to get different types of pledges and commitments from contributors to this. The announcement is due sometime later on this year. I think it's November, December time when they expect to announce. And so there's a lot of jostling. There was a lot of jostling in DC to try and get member states to commit. I think they're looking at a figure of around between $100 and $120 billion US for the replenishment this time around. I think 120 billion figures, one that was announced by the Kenyan president, His Excellency William Ruto, as being a very good and ambitious target for the replenishment. So there's a lot around that, as one would expect. Of course, there's a lot around Ajay Banga's roadmap evolution roadmap for the bank as well. I think one of his more popular quotes for the week was, trying to make the bank make 1 + 1 = 3, so to speak, in a time like that. But I think overall, the the sentiment is still that a lot of the financial crunch, that the solutions that seem to appear that they want it to come from the private sector. It's not going to come from the private sector. We need to find ways of strengthening the state. We need to find ways of giving governments confidence and empowerment and sovereignty to make decisions on how resources are allocated. And so, coming out of there, we felt that a lot more could have been done in that regard. But, that's why we're here, organizations like AFRODAD, to continue beating the drum to make sure that eventually we may beat them into submission in some cases.
But it must be a little crazy making coming from Kenya, where you've got a debt crisis, you've had civil unrest, and then you come to the United States, you come to Washington, and you hear people talking about the Trump election. I mean, as much as disturbing as that outcome would be for the globe, your reality is going to continue. And I maybe those meetings should be held. Maybe they should be advocating for those meetings to be held in Africa or Asia next time instead of in Washington. It sounds like a silly solution, but
Well, no. The annual meetings actually do alternate between DC and a different region. So last year they were in Morocco, in Marrakesh. It's the spring meetings that are always in DC. So they do rotate. But as it were, the choice of country tends to be more voluntary, strong political. So in the last few years, we've got countries hosting annual meetings that have had very restrictive civic space. Countries that don't necessarily and deliberately create very big buffers between civil society and member states' engagements. But also, these are meetings that are held in a bubble of extreme luxury. So the real lived experience of where people feel the impacts of the decisions taken by these meetings or these institutions is rarely felt, or is rarely observed, should I say, in that
Yeah.
sense. So, yes, they do circulate and they do rotate from different place to place, but I think for most of these guys, it's probably lost on them that market-based solutions don't work.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so funny though that you had not funny, but it's noteworthy. You had a post, a LinkedIn post.
Yes.
But that's I've been sort of following you vicariously through the LinkedIn post. Talking about. I think you hosted if I'm not mistaken, AFRODAD posted
Yes.
a, a panel discussion on a tale of two emergencies. Um, Looking at, and I think I'll just quote your LinkedIn feed. The discussions highlighted widespread public discontent in the global south due to austerity measures and preferred effective solutions to the debt and fiscal crises hindering development goals in our nation. I'd like to know, the question that I was going to ask you is about your key
Yes.
messages, but it just brings me back to sitting in a university classroom in the 1990s and talking about austerity. Has
Yeah.
anything changed?
Well, no, I mean, it hasn't. It hasn't. And I think the sad thing is it's gotten worse to the extent that there is this sense that fiscal consolidation and austerity are okay as policy measures, that it is okay to cut budgets in health, education, public sector spending, and public investments in order to create resource for creditors and private sector engagement or private sector investments in a country. It's absurd, that this seems to be the kind of language and policy direction that is being normalized. I mean, the IMF managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, said, it is time to continue with fiscal consolidation. And, it's very abrasive, to make these kinds of remarks and give these kinds of policy directions when you have, as you said, a lot of social unrest, a lot of social unease around the high cost of living, the extremely regressive set of tax policies that are being introduced in developing countries. The country I come from in Kenya, we are seeing the cost of living go up dramatically as a result of policy advice given by the IMF to the Kenyan government on broadening the tax base. We're seeing a huge social unrest because these tax measures are geared towards only servicing debt primarily. And at the face of it, we're seeing reductions in government investments in education, in health, and in the public sector. So it's extremely worrying that we are normalizing this idea that you can do budget cuts, that you can do austerity, and let the general public subsidize creditors at the expense of development and access to public services. So it is very worrying, and part of this session that we had in the margins of the IMF meetings was to highlight that these types of measures and these types of policy prescriptions that the IMF places before countries, at some point they are likely to be tantamount to contravening human rights, right? The basic human rights of the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to food, because you have individual citizens having to trade off meals in order to pay rent, or having to trade off medical care in order to pay school fees, right? So, this is tantamount to undermining and a gross negligence towards the attainment of basic human rights on the continent. And that kind of advice, really needs to be held to account. And that's why we had the session, was to, really press home the point that fiscal consolidation and austerity measures can result in social injustices, human rights injustices, because you are telling a government to forego the rights of their citizens in order to pay a creditor to them to be able to access capital markets.
And I have 3 points I want to make on this at one
Yeah.
time, which is possible. But that's how much you've
Yeah.
inspired me. I think the first point is that I noticed on my LinkedIn feed that Nigel Clark, the Minister of Finance in Jamaica, is retiring. And of course, Jamaica has been, in some ways, a victory and a poster child for effective oversight or effective addressing public debt, right? They've, since 2013, since the original debt crisis, they've managed to have successive governments continue on the right path. They now have a fiscal council. They've done many of the right things. But what I think was missing in the Jamaican case was that, when I was talking to the Ministry of Finance a number of years ago, they had no sense of what it meant to do a gender budget, or they had no sense of how to understand the impacts of policies on marginalized population groups. And so, I know the IMF and the Jamaicans, with all respect to them, were very happy about how things turned out. But I don't think the idea of figuring out how to go through a debt crisis while also addressing fiscal space issues and making sure the most vulnerable population groups are being looked after. I don't think that's ever really been something that's been part of the conversation.
No, it hasn't. And I think, this is the complexity of where we find ourselves at the moment in some of these conversations, is that you have the strengthening of oversight institutions, but their purpose sometimes, not all the time, sometimes is to ensure that the fiscus is able to be leveraged to access capital, and not necessarily to leverage investments in public services or to broaden the access and to move towards universality of access. Look, I think both can be achieved if there is strong political will to serve citizens, which, it's a difficult balance to tread for a government that has a very narrow fiscal base. And by narrow fiscal base, I mean here in terms of how it generates money.
Right.
Many
Revenue
of,
base.
yeah, the revenue base is very narrow because they rely primarily on raw materials, commodities. In the case of countries or states like Jamaica and many others in Africa rely on their forex exchange reserves from tourism.
Right.
So this very narrow base is part of the agenda that, we as civil society and we as AFRODAD are trying to advocate for, is to say, look, you can't just look at financial issues. You need to look at financial, economic, production and trade. Because if you fix trade,
Right.
countries can produce. If countries can produce, that means they generate finance. If they generate finance, then they can invest in public services and look after their financial partners, the creditors, and so on and so forth. So it's an entire ecosystem. And so when we're talking about trying to fix the debt situation on the continent, we're not just saying, look, give us debt cancellation or give us debt relief or debt service suspension. We want all of that plus all these other things, allow us to trade, allow us to export or develop manufacturing, allow us to, use state policies and state legal frameworks that are within the framework of the World Trade Organization to allow and foster the development of domestic industries beyond just the extractivism of raw commodities. Let us move up the value chain. Let's have genuine technology transfer. If that is not going to happen, then allow us to develop our own technology, allow us to use taxes, allow us to use other types of policies to enable those technologies to develop and the manufacturing and industrial base to expand within the context of developing countries. Because every country that is developed and is high income has gone down that path. They've used government policies, a combination of taxation as well as legal frameworks and sort of incentivizing domestic research and development, domestic investment in producing the capital accumulation and the industrial accumulation within the economy. So I think it's good that parliamentary oversight examples like in Jamaica are showing that it can be done, but I think it needs to go further. And I think that political will to go beyond just the oversight for the sake of paying your creditors is something that we need to constantly work on.
Yes. And I agree with you. And I think that, like I said to you privately, that's one of the reasons I'm so humbled to talk to you and hear about AFRODAD's work is that you're looking at the whole ecosystem. I tend to work horizontally, so I try to bring different players together, but I find my picture is fairly myopic in terms of, vis-a-vis that ecosystem approach that you're taking. So I really do respect that and admire that a lot. In the time we have left, I think 2 points I want to make. One is that on November 6th, and I'm not a full-time webinar participant or a full-time podcast host, so I don't need to plug it. But as you know, in the webinar that we're doing on November 6th, part 3 of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy and AFRODAD and other organizations series, we're talking about, which I'll be moderating that particular one, we're talking about the role of civil society in monitoring IMF agreements. And it just seems to me that if you're feeling that, that we're getting nowhere, I don't know how the we, I hope you don't mind me tacking on the me to the you to make we.
No worries.
But if you don't
The more
mind
the
that,
merrier. The more the merrier.
fair enough. Thank you.
We need insiders as well.
I appreciate that. But if you think that we're not getting anywhere, it's interesting to look at the case studies of Kenya and Sri Lanka, where the CSO community really felt that, despite this being something like 18th IMF agreement in the history of these two countries, and I know Ghana feels very much the same way, that the austerity measures and even the mitigation, the governance mitigation measures really were developed in a vacuum without consulting the international community and without involving them in meaningful consultations or monitoring.
Yeah.
It seems to me that until that changes, we're not going to go anywhere.
Well, for sure. I mean, I think, it's not a case of, I think these are incremental things that we need to look at. The World Bank, the IMF are 8 years old as institutions. As development institutions have not done much for Africa and for developing regions. And so, yes, I can understand why, I myself and many of us in the civil society space are very sometimes deflated about, the work that's going on in there. But that said, we can't stop pressing. There's always individual case studies where things are moving, things, marginally, but they do move. And we need to do our three or four things, right? The first one is continue collecting those case studies, because eventually they will amass to quite a number of case studies. So you'll move from having just Kenya and Sri Lanka. Maybe at some point you'll have Bangladesh, you'll have Ghana, you'll have Zambia, you have Argentina, you'll have Nepal, you name it. You'll have all these different countries from the developing world, and it will make a solid dossier of just really how ineffective the fund is, but at the same time how those dossiers have contributed to moving things a little bit in a particular direction. I think number two is that you have to say within the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, we are now seeing that countries, the region of Africa, for example, now has 3 executive directors in both institutions. So the third executive director for Africa at the International Monetary Fund has been announced. I think they're likely to start later on this year. They're from the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. And I think that offers some additional opportunity compared to what we've had in the past. So the onus is on civil society a little bit to engage in that and see what's going on there and see how to leverage it. Is it going to change the power dynamics at the fund? No, it's not. But the fact that you have 3 African executive directors rather than 2 is better, right? So the question is, how do you leverage that? I think the third one is we need to continue paying very close attention to the policy advice at the national level. We've seen this in the case of Kenya, where, I think very disturbingly, the IMF has sort of started washing its hands off, some of the policy advice it gave the Kenyan government. And on the one hand, it's saying, we didn't tell the Kenyan government to tax bread. It was the Kenyan government's decision. but really implicitly they did, because they told the Kenyan government, you need to broaden the tax base. In very basic IMF language, that translates to increase VAT, right? Base value added tax. And that's what the government did. And because there's not a lot to tax in Kenya anyway, bread and other sort of basic commodities fell into that basket. So we need to hold that to account. We need to challenge that and tell the IMF, you can't throw the Kenyan government. Despite its challenges, you cannot throw the Kenyan government under the bus. You gave them that policy advice. I think the other thing they're trying to say is that the Kenyan government didn't communicate effectively about this. Yes, okay, maybe they did, but again, the advice came from the IMF. It didn't come from the National Treasury of Kenya or the central bank. It came from the IMF. And I think these types of things we need to continue really pressing home. I advocate for dealing with national issues, and all developing countries, all countries in the world actually have domestic governance issues. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. But I don't advocate for the absolving of institutions that provide the policy advice. And I think we need to hold that to account. I think the third one is that we need to think about normative change and where power lies in some of these debt issues. And really finding an opportunity to move away from the Washington consensus-based institutions to a more democratic, participatory set of multi-stakeholder or multilateral institutions. And one of the proposals that we have been making in Washington, and we're now making them up here in New York, is for a process that will lead to the creation of a UN framework convention on sovereign debt. And here you have sort of normative foundations that govern and sort of give the narrative of how debt restructuring, debt relief, debt governance, and debt arbitration can be done under the auspices of the United Nations. So, this is being now propositional. So as much as we lament about what goes on in DC, we're like, well, it hasn't worked for 80 years. Let's move up the road to New York and put it there where African voices are a lot more powerful in terms of votes, a lot more coherent, because you've got a bigger constituency of developing countries, developing regions within the UN who live these things every day and are willing to use their voting power to advance this. And then I think the fourth thing is really this democratizing of economic and financial governance, which the UN as a multilateral system offers, right? Here, even though there's a lot of political jostling and diplomacy negotiating, one vote, one country, right? It's an equalizer. And so if we as civil society get our cards right, play our cards right, we can actually get all developing regions and developing countries to vote in favor of a process within the UN to set up this framework convention on sovereign debt under the SDG agenda, financing for development. The conference is in Sevilla, Spain next year, so the process is ongoing. So we've taken that to Washington. We've come back here to New York to sort of hang out with the folks at the UN to talk through what that's going to look like and why we think it's an important space to do that.
I'm just thinking about how you need to keep how you must be very good at keeping your optimism, going from that lackluster conversation in Washington to the UN and just.
We have to. Well, look, I mean, I think, we've been buoyed by what happened last year here in New York, right? The Africa Group plus developing regions voted through at the General Assembly for the creation of or establishment of a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. That's monumental. They used their votes. This could not have happened at OECD, where people were saying the process should be, because the G7 would have just dominated it, right? So we've come to a more democratic space. The UN has its issues, but we've come to a more democratic space where a country's vote means it is a country's vote and it's equal, right? And so we can apply the principles of democracy here with one country, one vote, very aptly, and it gets to move towards a more democratic economic governance structure that is progressive and that acts as an equalizer for countries in the developing world, particularly in Africa.
two last questions.
Yes.
Going back to the lenders and the slash creditors, I think about the UNCTAD principles on responsible lending and borrowing that just, no private sector, I think two private sector organizations have been willing to sign on to. I know that Net Justice UK was talking about this. I think I actually talked to Tim Jones about this in a previous podcast interview. Has there been any progress in, I don't want to say holding the private sector to account, that's going to scare everybody, but, realizing the incredible role that the private sector plays in countries like Zambia and helping them consolidate their debt during a crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so at AFRODAD, so we're spearheading together with our other partners the call for this UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, which within it has the principles on responsible lending and responsible borrowing. And I think you'll be aware that, for instance, AFRODAD's African Borrowing Charter has principles there that can actually help advance commercial creditor accountability and transparency. So things like your public debt registry, for example, things like using principles around beneficial ownership to understand who are the bondholders when Eurobonds or sovereign bonds are issued. Where are they based? What are they being used for? I think we've seen the consequence of the lack of participation of private sector in the case of Zambia. It's been very difficult to get them to restructure. It's been very difficult to get them to take things like haircuts in that. The second point here is around when we're thinking about private sector, you need to also start thinking about credit rating agencies, because they are the ones that act as the police or the indicators for private sector. So we need to also find within this framework convention a set of rules and principles that regulates and governs credit rating agencies. Within the framework convention on debt that AFRODAD and others are advocating for, we're proposing a process that establishes a UN-led credit rating agency that is more transparent, that is more democratic, and so on. So there are ways in which you can do this. That the principles around sovereign borrowing and sovereign lending is part of the broader detail of what this UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt would look like, that AFRODAD and its partners are advancing and advocating for under the auspices of the United Nations.
Okay, last question, because I know you have to run.
Yeah.
Because you're still at the UN meetings, right? You've got people behind you. Yep. So I think this question will require us just to back up. This is the last question on the list that I gave you. So just to back up and take a more sort of starting point view. I talked about the fact that I'm very excited to be hosting this asynchronous course for Parliamentary Network Africa for civil society organizations all across Africa. And it's really a public financial management course. We're talking about the budget cycle, and we're talking about oversight of public debt. So my intention is to actually use what you're going to say now, no pressure, of course, but as a clip for them to hear. What would your key messages be for these CSOs? Bearing in mind that their starting point, they may just be getting their head around better oversight, better public participation. What would your key messages be to these organizations that participate?
Yeah, sure. And I hope you don't mind me doing a bit of AFRODAD sales pitch promotion. But I think the starting point would be, look, visit our website, afrodad.org. We've got 3 foundational documents there that can be of great help. The first one is the African Borrowing Charter. It sets out in very clear, plain, simple, easy to understand terms around why it is important for there to be principles on responsible borrowing and lending. And within there are pillars around what accountability looks like, what the legal and policy framework should be defined to, and the role of oversight, and finally the role of participation in the public. So I think that would be the first one. I think the second document to look at is the Harare Declaration, which we developed in 2021, that presents and posits AFRODAD's view of the debt crisis on the continent. We developed it with several other partners, including 6 organizations and AFRODAD that we collectively call the Stop the Bleeding campaign against illicit financial flows and tax. And it sort of gives a political economy framing of the problem of why we're in debt. The third document is to read the Maputo Manifesto, which is a document that came out of our fourth African Conference on Debt and Development. Again, it's about framing the debt situation on the continent and the potential solutions that we can actually have. So that would be the first piece of advice. Get these foundational documents and read them and familiarize yourself. The second one, which is less promotory, but more, in terms of more practical stuff, is to always remember that budget cycles are not always about where money is allocated. It's about where money is derived from or generated from. And, civil society organizations that are involved in engagement in budget transparency, budget governance, and so on, needs to understand where does the money come from. The government is very good at saying we raised X billion of dollars worth of tax, but they're less keen on saying, we're going to borrow Y billion to plug a gap. So I think familiarizing yourself with the budget cycle in those terms is extremely important, because that's when you start seeing the link between this idea. When we talk about fiscal consolidation or austerity, you start to see the dotted lines between the policy prescription and the budget cycle, and they start to sort of sync. The third thing I'd say is, look, engage in one way or another with either parliamentary committees, so learn who they are, learn how they work, but also within Parliament, there's usually parliamentary budget officers that serve the committees. And in my experience, these are very pro-citizen organizations or departments or divisions within the Parliament. And a few countries I've been to, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, these have been very, very useful allies in understanding process. And I think lastly is, let's understand processes as well. Let's read our legal documents. Let's read our laws. Let's understand that, there's a lot of public information out there based on our countries that our country governments produce and publish. I think, we are sometimes very quick to state that we don't have access to information. In many cases, it might be true, but there are instances, very good examples where governments do publish a lot of government information on public finances. So let's also familiarize when we are engaging, through civic education, through public participation. And the reason I'm saying to familiarize with the information that's out there is because we move from being holding accountable our leaders and our parliaments on how public resources are used to also, in addition to being propositional. So you can call out if things are not going the right way, but then because we are informed, because we familiarized ourselves with processes and documents, we can be propositional in solutions, and therefore we become allies. And it's okay to be a frenemy with your parliament or with your government, right? It's good to be a friend on certain things, but it's also good to be an enemy on other things, so that the lines are very clear. So for me, those would be the four things as you go toward this new course to speak to with the friends and the comrades who are advocating for strengthened financial oversight.
Amazing. Jason Rosario Braganza, I want to once again thank you for coming back on the podcast. I have tremendous respect for both you and the organization that you lead, and for your optimism and continued ability to fight so many battles on so many fronts at the same time. Good to talk to you. Safe travels back to Kenya, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Amazing, Jeff. Thank you so much, and all the very best with you as well. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.